Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. In 1975, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities held a series of public hearings that revealed that the United States government helped orchestrate coups in Guatemala and Iran and hashed out assassination plots for Patrice Lumumba of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Fidel Castro of Cuba. It also uncovered that the government infiltrated anti-war, civil rights, and black power groups, and that the CIA had used psychedelic drugs and torture on U.S. citizens. The committee is popularly remembered as the Church Committee, named after the committee's chair, Frank Church, a Democratic senator from Idaho who challenged Jimmy Carter in the 1976 Democratic primary. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life and times of Frank Church, and I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program James Risen. James Risen is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. Currently, he's writing for The Intercept, and he is the author of the book that he joins us to talk about called The Last Honest Man, the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, and the Kennedys, and one senator's fight to save democracy. It is co-authored with his son, Thomas Risen. James Risen, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I mean, the Church Committee, this is a subject that I have been fascinated for many years, ever since I really started as a political reporter. I began a political reporter as really my beat being the war on terror. So there was all these historic references to the Church Committee. It's also interesting to think about who was Frank Church himself, especially from Idaho, which may just on surface surprise some people. What kind of politician, what kind of senator was Frank Church?
Church was a fascinating, complicated man who really was a unique senator, the kind of politician we don't really see much anymore. He grew up in Boise. He was born in 1924 and was from the very beginning considered the smartest kid in Boise. He gained fame in high school when he won the National American Legion Oratory Contest, that was one of the largest national competitions for high schoolers at the time. That gave him a scholarship to go to Stanford. And then during World War II, he served as one of the youngest Army officers in the American Army in World War II. He was an intelligence officer serving in China towards the end of the war, and then went to law school after the war and developed cancer, and nearly died of cancer in the late 40s. And when he survived, he decided, I am going to change my life and become a bigger risk taker. He was kind of on a path to become like an establishment lawyer, and he decided to run for office in Idaho. And at the age of 32, he beat the incumbent Republican senator in Idaho in 1956, and became the Democratic senator from Idaho. And in the Senate in the late 1950s, befriended another young senator named John Kennedy, and developed a very volatile relationship with the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson. And the relationships he had with Kennedy and Johnson would really frame much of his career. Because in the early 1960s, he visited Vietnam in 1962, one of the first senators really to go to Vietnam. And he immediately recognized that the Vietnam War was a lot like his war in China, where the United States was supporting a corrupt, incompetent regime in China, and that Chiang Kai-shek. And he saw the South Vietnamese regime of Diem very similar light. And he thought the United States should not be in Vietnam far earlier than almost anyone else in Congress.
Yeah, you said 1962, when he went to Vietnam.
Yeah, and he became one of the most outspoken and leading critics of the Vietnam War for the rest of the war. And ultimately, his fight against Vietnam really shaped his whole career and made him. He had started in the Senate as kind of a conventional Democrat, a Cold War Democrat, which, if you remember, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Democrats were trying to be more hawkish than Republicans. After the McCarthy era of the early 50s, they had felt burned, and so they were out hawking, Eisenhower. And he changed. He was one of those people, but then Vietnam changed him, and he became progressively more radicalized by Vietnam. And by the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, he had concluded that the United States was on its way to becoming a militaristic empire. And that Vietnam was a symptom, not a cause of that. He thought that the rise of the national security state after World War II was leading to a series of endless wars. And he became committed to doing something about that. And the Church Committee was a product of his belief that the United States intelligence community was at the heart of a growing militaristic empire, and that the CIA and the intelligence community had to be reined in. And so that's how he got to become chair of the Church Committee.
Is he the first senator to oppose the war in Vietnam?
There were a couple others right before him, but they were not considered part of the mainstream at the time. They were, they didn't have the legitimacy or credibility in Washington that Church did. And so when Church turned against the war, it really bothered the power structure, and especially Lyndon Johnson. When Kennedy was president, Church sort of pulled his punches. He didn't want to go public because he and Kennedy were so close. But the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy White House, told him they wanted him to begin to criticize Diem and the incompetence of his regime, because they wanted to put pressure on Diem. This is right before the Kennedy administration staged a coup along with the CIA against Diem.
Of South Vietnam.
Yeah. And but then when Johnson came in as president, Church felt no compunction about opposing his policies publicly. And in 1965, if you remember, 1964, when Johnson won in a landslide, he promised the American people that he was not going to escalate in Vietnam. He was not going to put land forces in Vietnam. And then almost as soon as he won an election, he put major land forces in Vietnam and escalated in 1965. And Church felt that was a major betrayal, and he really turned against Johnson. And then when Nixon came in 1969, he continued to oppose the war. He saw Nixon's policy of what was then called Vietnamization, which was the Nixon effort to reduce the American troop levels in Vietnam in exchange for giving more aid to the South Vietnamese army. He saw that as for what it really was, which was a gimmick to reduce the protests in the streets against the war while allowing Nixon to continue the war indefinitely. And so Church began to use legislative efforts to stop the war. The legislative tool he used was called the Cooper-Church Amendments, and they were to defund the war, get Congress to cut off funding for combat operations. First in places like Thailand and then Cambodia, and then ultimately to cut off funding in Vietnam itself.
So before the Church Committee, we remember Frank Church for the Church Committee, but he has a whole political career before. The Church Committee really happened towards the end of his career.
Yeah, that's right. And he was already, this is in the early 70s before the Church Committee, he was already considered a radical anti-war leader. And it's interesting. He did this as a senator from one of the most conservative states in the country.
That was my next question. A radical from Idaho, and you even said when he won election, he defeated a Republican. Obviously, today Idaho's a very, very red state.
Right. Idaho at the time was more, it wasn't a swing state, but it wasn't as conservative as it is today. And there were lots of examples of Democrats winning in Idaho for many, many decades. In fact, one of the most shocking facts I learned in doing this book was that the Democrats won the presidential race in Idaho 5 straight years, from 1932 to 1948. Roosevelt and then Truman all won 5 straight times. And there were a lot of examples of Democratic governors and Democratic congressmen and senators during most of the 20th century. And it was really because there was northern Idaho was heavily unionized at the time with mines and timber operations. And so today, northern Idaho is considered probably the most right-wing area in the United States. At the time, it was a Democratic stronghold. And so it's one of the oddities of politics that during his career, Frank Church relied on northern Idaho to get reelected every
the most conservative part of Idaho.
Yeah, yeah. And so he won pretty handily in most of his elections. He was reelected. He won first in 1956, then again in 1962, in 1968, 1974, and then he finally was defeated in 1980 in the Reagan landslide. But in every year up until 1980, he won with at least like 58, 60% of the vote. And it was because he had a really good handle on what people in Idaho liked and wanted. He had very good constituent operations. And he was also very honest with people about what he was doing. He would go back to Idaho and give the same speeches about Vietnam that he did in Washington. And I think people would say at the time that I like the fact that he's honest and tells me exactly what he's doing. And Church would sit down with people and explain his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And he won re-election in probably the most difficult year in American politics, which was 1968, in the midst of all the volatility around, everything going on at that time.
And while he's becoming more radical.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's interesting.
It's fascinating because it's something that you don't see today, where you have this guy progressively changing. You don't see politicians evolve anymore. And he really was a very thoughtful man. And his wife, who was the daughter of a former governor of Idaho, a Democratic governor from the World War II, constantly told him, you gotta tone down this anti-war stuff because you're going to lose in Idaho. And he said, no, I'm not going to tone it down. Why am I here if I'm not going to do this? And he had a gut instinct that the people in Idaho would support him.
When we say he becomes more progressive, is it more progressive towards U.S. foreign policy, or is it all around? Is he domestically progressive?
It's mostly foreign policy, which is what he mostly cared about. I mean, his goal, he had 2 goals really before, early on, was either to be president or chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Or when he was a kid, his role model was William Borah, who had been a Republican senator from Idaho, a longtime senator, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so that was like a long-term goal. His main interest was reining in the national security state. He, in order to keep getting reelected, he did compromise. And he was very much opposed to gun control efforts at the time. and that was a big issue for him in Idaho. And but this was before, most of his races were really before the culture war, radioactive issues that we have today. Like abortion was not a big issue at the time, and you had a lot of lesser issues. So Vietnam was kind of the key issue that divided Republicans and Democrats for most of that time period. He was also pro-civil rights. He took a major role in civil rights legislation. And so he didn't try to downplay that or anything. The main compromise he made in Idaho was on gun control.
You mentioned his rocky relationship with Lyndon Johnson. Did he support things like Medicare or the other initiatives meant to address poverty?
Yes, yeah, he did. And so he voted, along with the Democratic leadership on those issues. But his main break with the Democratic Party establishment was Vietnam.
We are going to spend a good amount of time on the church committee's work because it's just wild.
Yeah.
But before I go directly to the church committee, what's important to understand about U.S. intelligence agencies sort of in the 50s and 60s, the decades before this committee would do its work?
One of the things, well, it's fascinating because, and this goes to the significance of the church committee, which is that the CIA was founded in 1947 by the National Security Act, and there was no congressional oversight. From 1947 until 1975, when the church committee was created, there was virtually no oversight of the U.S. intelligence community by Congress. The CIA had very clubby relationships with a couple of the old barons in the Senate and the House, and the CIA director would just go down and have drinks with like the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, who was almost always a old Southern segregationist who didn't want to really know any secrets. And they would have a couple drinks, and the CIA director would tell them, oh, this is basically how much we need, and that would be about it. And there was no effort to investigate anything. The American press was equally docile. There was virtually no real coverage or investigations of the CIA or the FBI, for that matter, or the NSA. And so the national security state of the post-war era really grew completely unmolested by scrutiny for 30 years. And as a result, the secrecy compounded on secrecy and abuse. And the only person they ever had to talk to really was the president. And in the late 40s, when Harry Truman was president, the CIA was created under Truman. His vision for what the CIA was going to be is very different from what it became. He wanted it to be a centralized place for the collection of intelligence reports and analysis, more of an analytical agency, because you had this problem of at Pearl Harbor, where the U.S. had collected information but never had put things together. And he wanted it to be a civilian agency separate from the military. And he also wanted it to be separate from the FBI, because he was afraid of turning the FBI into like a Gestapo organization. He didn't really, he didn't trust J. Edgar Hoover. He didn't want to give him any more power. But then when Dwight Eisenhower came in the early 50s, Eisenhower had a fear of a war with the Soviet Union. And he wanted to avoid a conventional war. And so he began to turn to the CIA as a covert weapon that he could use against the Soviet Union and its what he saw as its proxies, to conduct operations slightly below full-scale war. And it was Eisenhower really more than anybody else who transformed the CIA into this rogue entity that we later saw.
Kind of adds a little bit of context to what we commonly think of with Dwight D. Eisenhower as the one who warned against the military-industrial
Yeah,
complex.
I mean, that's one of the great ironies is that the man who created the national security state was the man who warned against it. Because he oversaw massive increases in budgets for the Defense Department and the CIA and the NSA and the FBI. And he oversaw a period of the McCarthy era. He never really was willing to rein anything in until he was on his way out the door. So under Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director under Eisenhower, began to wield this weapon that Harry Truman never anticipated. Staging coups, as you suggested earlier, and engaging in these rogue operations like MK Ultra, which was this drug mind control program that was totally crazy. And Eisenhower, I believe, from all the research I've done, as long as Dulles and the CIA did the big things that he wanted, like overthrowing governments or assassinating leaders, he let Dulles do the other things that he wanted. And so things like MK Ultra, I think, grew just below the level of presidential attention or scrutiny. And so as Dulles did, overturn governments, he was also able to do many other things that turned the agency into this rogue operation. And by the 60s, when Kennedy came in, Kennedy felt that, you had Cuba became the number one issue with Fidel Castro overthrowing the Cuban government. And the fear of communism, the phrase was communists 90 miles away from the United States, really animated the whole Kennedy administration. And Kennedy then wanted the CIA to do what it had done for Eisenhower. And from then on, until the Church Committee, the CIA was seen, every president wanted his own weapon, secret weapon. It was kind of like in The Godfather where, Michael Corleone says, I need my own Luca Brasi. They wanted their own hitmen. And so no one really turned off the CIA until the Church Committee. And the Church Committee was the first ever congressional investigation of the CIA and the NSA and the FBI.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Risen about the life and times of Frank Church. James Risen is the author of the book, The Last Honest Man, the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, and the Kennedys, and One Senator's Fight to Save Democracy. It's co-authored with his son, Thomas Risen. We've covered a lot of these stories that were uncovered by the Church Committee, from assassination plots against Patrice Lumumba, Fidel Castro, MK Ultra. We've done a show on that. I've never really, though, done a show focusing on how the committee operated itself, and this is some serious stuff. So, what is the impetus? How does this committee even get formed?
Well, I think you got to credit Mike Mansfield to a great degree. He was Senator Mike Mansfield was the Senate Majority Leader in the early 1970s when the Democrats controlled the Senate. And he had always wanted to investigate the CIA or create a committee to investigate the CIA. And ever since he joined the Senate in the 50s, he had been trying to do that. He had put legislation in repeatedly to get the Senate to create a CIA committee. And it constantly failed because the conservative Democrats in the Senate didn't want to go along with it. Finally, in 1974, when Nixon was right after Watergate, Nixon resigned in August of 1974. And then, if you remember, Gerald Ford came in as president, and he immediately pardoned Richard Nixon, which caused a huge firestorm in the 1974 midterm elections. And so the Democrats had a landslide victory in the 1974 midterm elections after Watergate. And so in late 1974, early 1975, the Democrats had a 60-seat majority in the Senate. They had about 295 House members. They had massive majorities in both houses. And so suddenly, Mansfield had the power to do what he wanted to do. And then in December 1974, a story came out in the New York Times by Seymour Hersh, which was probably one of the greatest stories that Hersh ever did. It was an investigation of the CIA and its massive spying program on American dissidents during the Vietnam War. And it also included a lot of other allegations against the CIA. And his story was so explosive that it led to calls in Congress for the creation or for investigations. And a lot of committee chairmen wanted to conduct their own investigations, but Mansfield decided this was the opportunity to create a whole new committee to investigate it. And so he created, in January 1975, he used the Hersh article as the predicate to create a new committee. It was a select committee, so it was temporary, but what he saw its purpose as a temporary committee that would pave the way for permanent oversight of the CIA and the intelligence community. And so his goal was to have a committee that would do its job so well that he could then get a vote later through the Senate to create a permanent intelligence committee. And that initially he wanted another senator to chair it, Senator Phil Hart of Michigan, who was a liberal, but he was kind of beloved by conservatives and liberals alike. And Mansfield thought he would be the perfect person who would bridge things between the Republicans and the Democrats on the committee. But Hart told him secretly that he had just been diagnosed with cancer and he couldn't do it. And he told Mansfield, you should get Church because he wants to do it. And so Mansfield turned to Frank Church. The irony for Church was he had just begun meeting with creating kind of a small cadre of supporters who wanted him to run for president in 1976. And he was just deciding at that moment that he was going to run for president. But when the opportunity to run this committee came up, he couldn't pass it up. And he decided to take on the committee. And when he met with Mansfield about it, Mansfield said, well, this will mean the end. This means the presidency. This will cost you the presidency. And Church promised him that he wouldn't run for president while the investigation of the committee was going on. And that frustrated Church's supporters. And it led to all kinds of criticism in the press of Church that he was using this as a platform for a future presidential run. And so that was the tension at the heart of what was going on with Church at the time he took over the Church Committee.
How did the FBI, CIA, and I guess NSA all respond to this sudden scrutiny that it had never faced before?
Well, first, the Ford White House tried to lead the fight against it. Gerald Ford had just come into office after an impeached president, or almost impeached president, had to resign. And the Supreme Court had he had resigned after the Supreme Court had ruled against him and ruled in favor of the Congress to get access to the tapes from the Oval Office, which sealed Nixon's fate. And Ford was not happy about this congressional investigation, but he also knew that he was very weak politically. Congress was overwhelmingly Democrat. The Supreme Court had just ruled against executive privilege. And he knew that it would be very difficult to stop the Senate from gaining access to documents and people and interviews at a time when he had never been elected. He hadn't been elected vice president, hadn't been elected president. And so after the Hirsch story came out, and there were all these calls for a big investigation, two of Ford's key aides, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Rumsfeld was White House Chief of Staff and Cheney was Deputy White House Chief of Staff, came up with this idea of creating a White House commission to investigate it. And it was clearly a way to, it was going to be a whitewash that would try to stop Congress from doing its own investigation. And so they created what was called the Rockefeller Commission, which was named for the new Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller. But it didn't stop the Senate or the House. The House created its own committee from conducting an investigation. And every time Cheney and Rumsfeld for the next few months kept telling Ford he had to fight and stop the church from getting access to documents and things, Ford ignored them because he knew he was weak, that after Watergate, he was in no position to fight Congress on things like executive privilege.
Well, one of the few moments in the last 70 years in which Congress kind of reigned supreme.
Yes, it did. And the CIA was going through an interesting dynamic of its own. The CIA had, under Richard Nixon, if you remember, after Nixon was reelected in 1972, he fired Richard Helms, the longtime CIA director, because he felt that Helms had not gone along sufficiently with the Watergate cover-up. And he wanted his own man at the CIA. And so he put in James Schlesinger, who was kind of a jerk. Everybody thought of him as a curmudgeon or a difficult person. And so he went in there as a hatchet man. But Schlesinger was also smart enough to know that he didn't want to take the fall for Watergate. And so when more information came out in early 1973 about the CIA's involvement with Watergate, information that Helms had withheld, he issued an order saying, I want everybody in the CIA who knows anything about any abuse to write a memo and talk to me and my people, and we're going to put together a memo of everything the CIA ever did that was wrong. And he did this in secret because he wanted to know what he should be afraid of now that Congress and Watergate were in midstream, and Watergate was going through this, there was this massive investigative atmosphere in Washington, and he didn't want to be surprised. And so he created this document that became known as the Family Jewels, which was a secret document that listed virtually everything the CIA had done wrong for decades, or at least what people inside thought they had done wrong. And it was kept secret. And then Schlesinger left very quickly after a few months because Nixon was in crisis mode and he kept moving people around different jobs. And so a new CIA director came in, William Colby, who had run the Phoenix program in Vietnam, the assassination program in Vietnam. And he was left with this document, the family jewels. And he was left with a CIA that had to navigate Watergate, and then the Hirsch story. And
is Hirsch's story based on the family jewels?
Partly, yeah. He didn't know the whole. He didn't have the whole thing, but he had bits and pieces of it. And so that was the beginning, really, of when the church committee finally got all of the family jewels that really led to a lot of their investigations.
3 people who were witnesses to this committee would be assassinated.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this was such a dangerous enterprise. It's hard to think back to 1975 and realize how new this idea was. We're going to actually investigate the CIA, and we also were going to actually hold hearings about the National Security Agency, which most people didn't know existed. And they were going to investigate the FBI, which had never been investigated. The only reason they were able to investigate the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover had just died. And that made it possible, finally, to conduct an investigation. But they were getting into some very radioactive things, including one of the first things they did was, and probably one of the most landmark investigations, was their investigation of the CIA's alliance with the Mafia to kill Fidel Castro, which had been ordered up during the Kennedy administration, in the late Eisenhower and early Kennedy administration. And 2 of the witnesses, they began to investigate, and they ordered the testimony of a man named Johnny Rosselli, who was a gangster from Las Vegas and Los Angeles, and Sam Giancana, who had been the mob boss of Chicago. And both Giancana and Rosselli had been involved in the CIA, in the mob alliance with the CIA to kill Castro. They, right out, Rosselli testified before the church committee, and then after testifying, his body was found floating in a barrel in Biscayne Bay off Miami. And Sam Giancana was ordered to testify, and right before he was to come to Washington to testify, he was shot in his basement of his house in Chicago. The third witness was Orlando Letelier, the foreign minister of Chile under Allende, who had fled. He had been imprisoned and then got released and had fled to the United States, and he was being interviewed by the church committee about Chile and the CIA's role there. And then he was blown up in a car bomb in downtown Washington. So 3 witnesses, and it's an amazing
Do all 3
series.
Do all 3 of these cases remain unsolved?
The Giancana and Rosselli murders have never been solved. Most people believe, and the FBI had evidence of this at the time, that they were murdered by the mob, that hits were ordered on them. And a lot of people over the years have argued that it wasn't because of their testimony to the church committee, but I disagree with that. I think both of them were also had been talking to federal grand juries in other cases involving the mob. But I think that there was a kind of a collective decision by the mob that they talked too much, including to the church committee.
What was this? Yeah, what was this connection of the mob and the CIA?
In 1960, the CIA, which had been under pressure from Eisenhower and to get rid of Fidel Castro, reached out through a contractor, a former FBI agent named Robert Mayhew. They asked Mayhew to find some gangsters who could help him kill Castro. And Mayhew then, he was, as I said, a contractor with the CIA. He had met Johnny Rosselli in Los Angeles and in Las Vegas. And so he then went out and had lunch with Rosselli and said, can you get together a team where you can, a mobster team to kill Castro? And Rosselli knew, kind of worked with Giancana. And so he went and met with Sam Giancana. And they, kind of the three of them were the key players in the efforts to kill Castro for the CIA. It never accomplished much of anything, but they continually tried to get poisons to people in close to Castro in Havana to kill him, but it never worked.
And the mob was mostly running the casinos, right, in Cuba before the revolution?
Yeah, that was the argument that the CIA had was, well, they hate Castro too because they lost their casinos. But it's unclear how serious the Mafia took this. But they did work with the CIA for a long time, and there'd been hints of this over the years before the Church Committee began to investigate it. But they were the first ones to do a major investigation of what had happened.
I do remember just a few years ago, I think it's the Senate Intelligence Committee conducted its own investigation into the intelligence agencies for abuses during the War on Terror. Right. And we found out that some of these intelligence agencies were conducting surveillance, illegal surveillance against the committee itself. Did this happen during the Church Committee? Did these agencies try to, use their power against this committee or these senators?
There was a lot of the committee staff and the members all feared that was going on, but they were never sure of it. But they tried to take as many steps as they could to make sure that didn't happen. There was one guy on the committee staff who had to resign because he had been reportedly had been leaked some material or talked about some material at a restaurant in front of where some FBI agents overheard him. But there's never been any proof of that. One of the things that Church feared was that the CIA was so angry with his investigation that they tried to torpedo his presidential campaign. And that he found out, or he told his son later, that when Carter was considering Church to be his vice presidential running mate, and while that process was going on, Church got a call from the CIA saying, we have proof that there was KGB agents inside the Church Committee staff, and The Economist magazine is about to run a big story saying that. And no story ever came out. Nobody, the reporter they told Church was doing it didn't exist. And it was clearly rumor mongering that he came to believe was an effort by the CIA to discredit him and make sure that Carter didn't choose him as vice president.
Do you think there's truth to that in your investigation?
It's hard to tell, but it's certainly what Church believed.
Yeah. Talk to me about the effect that the Church Committee then would have. Many of our current laws that regulate the intelligence agencies, even the formations of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and our FISA court, something we talk about there. There's a lot of laws in place now that we routinely criticize for not being strong enough, but none of these regulations existed before the Church Committee. But all of these actually would come out of this work. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. These are laws that have been are flawed, and people criticize them today. But prior to the Church Committee, none of those existed. There were no laws. There were no rules. The CIA could do whatever it wanted. The FBI could do whatever it wanted. The NSA could do whatever it wanted. Nobody even knew what this NSA was doing. And so FISA was probably the landmark legislation that was created directly as a result of the Church Committee, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was the first law to rein in the ability of the NSA or the FBI or the CIA to conduct wiretapping inside the United States on American citizens without a court order. And the creation of permanent intelligence committees was also a direct result of the Church Committee. There were a lot of other laws and legislation and executive orders banning, for instance, the assassinations of foreign leaders, the use of American journalists by the CIA or ministers. And then there were a lot of new rules and administrative changes that reined in the power of the FBI. One of the things that Church had a parallel investigation at the same time as the Church Committee that was investigating multinational corporations and their power around the world. He conducted the investigation into Lockheed, which was bribing foreign officials all over the world to buy Lockheed planes. And so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed directly as a result of Church's investigation into that. So people don't remember that the late 1970s, after the Church Committee, was a period of real reform when Congress was heavily Democratic, and Jimmy Carter was president. And so a lot of the reforms were passed during the Carter administration. They stayed on the books without much change until 9/11. And it was then when Cheney, who had been so frustrated by Church in 1975, was now vice president, and he began to rail against all of the limitations on the intelligence community that had been put in place by the Church Committee.
Gloves off. Interesting connection.
Right.
James Risen, you have been covering intelligence agencies for a long time, have won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes for that coverage. You almost faced jail time for your refusal to divulge a source that you had during the Obama presidency. I want to ask you about today. Once again, we're hearing allegations that there is a deep state or an intelligence, apparatus within the government that is going after conservatives. We have in the House of Representatives a committee on the weaponization of the federal government headed by Jim Jordan. What's your thoughts about just general these allegations that are being made and about this committee specifically?
Well, I think the Republican committee is ridiculous. I mean, one of the most hilarious things is that Jordan has said that his committee is the new Church Committee, which is really not true at all. The Church Committee was a serious investigation that was largely bipartisan into the history of the CIA's abuses and the FBI's abuses. What the Republicans are now want to do is make a partisan attack, claiming somehow that there is a deep state that is anti-Republican, which is totally false, totally ridiculous. There is a military-industrial complex in America, a large homeland security, intelligence, defense, contracting base that has a gravitational pull towards war in the United States. But that is very different from a woke deep state, which is the idea that somehow this massive defense, intelligence, homeland security establishment is somehow filled with progressives and leftists, which I am yet to meet those people who they claim to exist. And it's really all derives from the fact that Donald Trump got investigated.
I think they would say, maybe it's not anti-Republican, I think they would say it's anti-Trump. And,
yeah, well,
pro-establishment.
He was doing things that deserved investigation. Let's say that. And so it's just a false premise of the whole thing. And so they have taken, they're very good at propaganda because they come up with a narrative and then they keep repeating it, which is the key to propaganda and disinformation. And so they have taken, and most propaganda is based on a kernel of truth, which is there is a military-industrial complex in America. And then they pervert that and turn it around and say that it's somehow a bunch of progressives that have to be stopped from turning America into a woke country. And so that's the problem I have with that.
What about some of the reporting from folks like Matt Taibbi and others concerning the Twitter files, the FBI communicating with Twitter? What do you think about that?
Not much. I think it's pretty stupid. The fact that
the reporting is, or
yeah, I think the reporting is pretty stupid and facile, and the idea that the U.S. government wants to help moderate social media to stop disinformation. Okay, you can say that they shouldn't do that, fine, but it doesn't bother me too much.
It's not.
I don't think it's a significant issue.
Yeah. It's not partnering with the Mafia to take out a world leader.
It's not. It doesn't tell you that the government is somehow after Republicans. I mean, what the Republicans want is to discredit all government. They are really nihilists at this point. And I think that what they want in its place is a right-wing dictatorship. And I think there are a lot of leftists who have fallen for that and somehow think that somehow, oh yeah, I should join this effort to support these right-wing autocrats, which to me is crazy. I mean, people like Taibbi, I think, are being misled. He's fallen in with an oligarch, Elon Musk.
James Risen has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about the life and times of Frank Church. He's the author of the book that he joined us to talk about called The Last Honest Man, the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, and the Kennedys, and the One Senator's Fight to Save Democracy. It is co-written with his son, Thomas Risen. James Risen, I thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.